Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. I hope you guys are all having a wonderful Monday. Now, as most of the United States heads into winter time, and here in Wisconsin we had our first morning below freezing, I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to talk about some different methods you can use to heat your crested geckos. But before we get into talking about that, we need to kind of cover what kind of heat your crested geckos actually need. So crested geckos are kind of interesting because unlike leopard geckos that need belly heat, and unlike some other reptiles that need a really warm basking spot, crested geckos would really just prefer ambient heat. And what this means is they'd prefer their tank to just be an overall temperature. Like, they don't need a warm spot, they don't need the cool spot, they just like the nice overall warm temperature, preferably between 70 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, if it goes a little above this or a little below this for a short period of time, it's not going to harm them, but really you're shooting for 70 to 80 degrees all times of the day. Now, as you can imagine, this can be kind of difficult, and there is some solutions to heating your crested geckos up. If you've been following me for any amount of time, you know this is something that I've personally struggled with here in Wisconsin as long as I've been doing this. So today I wanted to give you guys some options and some things you can do to heat up your geckos, and I also wanted to talk about some methods you should not use. Some of these are hopefully common sense, but I wanted to be thorough and cover them all, just so nobody makes any mistakes that are going to hurt their gecko. Now, this is going to be in order from worst to best, at least in my opinion, and I want to just be thorough and cover everything. So the worst method you can possibly use to heat your crested geckos is direct sunlight. Unless, of course, you want to make a crispy gecko sandwich, in which case this is perfect for you, but for the rest of us, this is just a terrible method, and let me explain why. Obviously, number one, you're going to fry your geckos. Number two, if it's a cloudy day, it's nighttime, the sun's not out, obviously your gecko's not going to be heating up. This shouldn't even be on your radar of things to use to heat your gecko. I just want to throw that in there though. Don't use this, don't do it. Moving on to some more normal things, using a regular light bulb might seem like a good option, but it is not a great one, and let me explain why. Using a regular light bulb would be okay for some other reptiles, but for crested geckos who need ambient heat, it's not really a good option because they're going to need it 24/7, and obviously you don't want a bright light bulb shining on your gecko during the middle of the night. So this really isn't a good option, and it's not going to be able to produce probably enough heat and far enough down in your tank to actually do any good. Even if you're using this with a thermostat, it's just really not worth it. And a thermostat is going to come into play a little bit later, but regular light bulbs I would also throw out and not even consider. Also, something I wanted to mention is that some of these options are going to work better depending on the amount of lizards you have. If you have one or two lizards versus a whole room, there's really kind of no in between. I figure most people either have one, two, maybe a couple lizards, or they have an entire room of them like me. So some of these are going to be better options for either one, and I'll kind of let you know that as we go along. But our third option is using a space heater. Now, this would be better if you were having it to fill a room full of heat versus just one or two animals, but there's a couple reasons why using a space heater isn't really a good idea. I would consider this option more of a temporary fix, or maybe something to use in the case of an accident. Like, let's say for whatever reason your room got really cold and you need to heat them all up quick. This would be where you'd use a space heater, but using a space heater as your main source of heat isn't good because, one, depending on the size of your room and the size of the space heater, it's going to use a lot of electricity up, for one, and probably run up your bill big time. But also, two, space heaters are a good source of fires, and obviously you don't want to start a fire in your gecko room. So I wouldn't really use this as your main source of heat. However, if this, you got into some situation where your room was too cold, I think it might be good to have one of these on hand just as a backup if you needed to use it. Coming in kind of tied with that spot is the under tank heater. Now, this is something that you'd use more for leopard geckos, but for crested geckos it doesn't really apply. Going back to what we talked about earlier about ambient heat, obviously the heat pad, if you don't know what an under tank heater is, it sticks to the glass. You can use it on the bottom or on the side of your tank. Well, wherever you put that, it's going to be a lot warmer, and the other side is going to be a lot cooler. And if you put it on the bottom, the heat will rise, but nowhere near as much as you're going to need. It would be way too hot on the bottom of the tank to get the heat all the way up to the top. So that's why I don't really consider this one a good one. I mean, it's probably better than nothing, but again, you're going to need a thermostat for this. And a thermostat's going to run you about $100, give or take, and the under tank heater is going to run you about $20. And for that kind of money, I really don't think it's worth it, especially considering that would only be working for one lizard then, and you could possibly have 2, 3, 4. It's going to run you up, and it's not really that effective. Now you might be saying, geez Sam, is there any good way to heat up my crested geckos? And I came up with 2 pretty good ways, depending on if you have just a couple geckos or if you have a whole room of geckos like me. So if you had just a couple geckos, here's what I would probably do. They make something called a ceramic heat emitter, which looks kind of like a light bulb. It fits into a light bulb kind of socket, but it gives off no light. It just gives off heat. And it also projects a little bit farther than a light bulb would with heat, so it can get farther down in your tank, which is a good thing. Now the only unfortunate side of this is you're also going to need a thermostat again, because you don't want it to get too hot and cook your geckos. I'm not going to go into any detail on how you set this up, but basically you would just set your probe at the top near your ceramic heat emitter where it's going to be the warmest, set it to like 80 degrees or whatever temperature you want it to be, and then anything below that would hopefully be less than 80 degrees. If you're really curious about this, you can look up another video on how to set one up, but this is what I would recommend if you just have a couple geckos. The only reason being, again, is because you're going to need a thermostat. Thermostats only have so many plugs, and if you have 20, 30 lizards, this is going to be really impractical for you. But if you have 1 or 2 geckos, this would work great. Just make sure you're being safe and you're getting a thermostat, because I don't want anybody to fry your geckos. And last but not least, here's what I would do if you had an entire room full of geckos. I would just heat up your entire room. Whatever kind of heating you have in your house, try and use it to heat up the entire room that your geckos are in. If your geckos are in separate rooms, I'd move them all into the same room and just try and heat up that room specifically. This is pretty much the best solution I've came up with over the years, and this is what I try and do now. I live in an older, bigger house with higher ceilings, in Wisconsin, of course, and it's very cold here in winter time. So if I did not do that, it would be hovering right around 68, 67 degrees. What I found is there's 3 doors going into my gecko room. If I close 2 of them and leave one open, and the radiator's on, if you don't know what a radiator is, basically it's just like a big rectangle made out of metal that circulates hot water. That's how my house is heated. Basically, if you do that, it'll heat it up a couple degrees above 70, and that seems to work out great. That's pretty much the best solution I have. I would definitely do this over using the space heater for heating a large area. It's a little bit safer, obviously, but that's about all the methods I have to heat your crested geckos up. If you feel like you have a better method, please leave a comment down below. Anyway, with that being said, hopefully this video helped you out a little bit. I gave you a couple different options here that you could use, so hopefully that's enough. If it did help you out, please leave a like down below on the video. It would help my channel out and I would appreciate it. And with that being said, I hope to see you guys in my next video.